Patch 13.16 is upon us with some nerfs, some buffs, and many other changes too. Starting with nerfs, we have Neferi, who is losing 2 base armor, 2 base attack damage, and a small amount of attack speed. The second nerf goes to Rek'Sai, whose Q will now deal flat damage plus bonus AD rather than percentage total AD, which is a decent loss of damage. After this, we have Shaco, who is losing a chunk of base mana regen, but also his W at all ranks will now cost 70 mana, which will affect Shaco's support more than anything else. Next, we have Shyvana, whose W will now deal less flat damage and less scaling damage on the ability and on the on-hit damage. And the final nerf goes to Tristana, who's actually gaining 4 base armor and a small amount of armor growth per level, but as a consequence losing 30 health and 2 base magic resist, helping her move back down to the bot lane and not be quite so dominant in the mid lane. As for buffs, the first one goes to Akali, whose Q will now cost a good amount less energy in the early levels, and the damage has been increased by 5 at all ranks. Next we have Brand, whose passive will restore even more mana, and his Q and E will both scale better with AP, which helps his mid lane viability most of all. Following this, we have a fun one for Caitlyn, where she'll now proc her headshots every 6 auto attacks instead of every 7. Next we have Echo, whose Q will deal 10 additional damage at all levels, and the slow is being increased in the early levels. In addition, his W will now give him 30 additional flat shield for a massive amount of extra survivability. Following this, we have Karma, whose Q will now scale even better with AP, and her ultimate late game will be back up even faster. Next, we have a solid buff for Lucian, with his passive now dealing an additional 15 damage on hit, which may well bring him back into the meta with the damage to bully again. Following this, we have Lulu, who will be getting 4 additional health per level. In addition, both her Q and her E's help picks will now scale 50% effectively with AP. Next we have Milio, who was nerfed a little bit too hard recently. To counter this, they've now made his Q damage deal slightly less damage in the early game, but massively more assets leveled. And in addition to this, it now has an absurd 120% AP scaling. Both of these changes makes Q a far more tempting option to now max. In addition, his E when leveled up will now shield for even more, and also now scales better with AP, which then also makes E a very tempting option to max still. So it will be interesting to see which ends up being meta. Following this, we have Nidalee, where her E in Cougar form will now scale with 40% bonus AD. This is a really good buff for any AD Nidalee players out there, but I haven't seen an AD Nidalee player in a very long time. Next we have Sylas, who is very simply and very favourably gaining 90 additional base mana, which honestly is just a massive quality of life buff for him. And the final buff goes to Wukong, who is gaining additional mana regen growth. His Q will now only cost 20 mana, and his W costs significantly less mana during its first few levels. In addition to all these nerfs and buffs, we also have an adjustment for Malzahar, where his E will now tick every quarter of a second rather than every half a second. They've also made the adjustment where it executes minions at lower health, which does sound like a nerf, however overall this should just simply make his farming with E smoother. We also have a number of lethality item changes, with Axiom Arc now refunding 10% flat ultimate cooldown plus lethality, Duskblade now only procs once every 30 seconds and will deal slightly less missing health damage, Prowler's Claw now procs every 5 seconds and scales better with bonus AD, Serpent's Fang now grants 15 lethality, and finally Umbral Glaive now grants 13 lethality. And we have some lovely new Immortal Journey skins for Kayle, Shyvana, Sona, Soraka, Zed and Zeri.